Thanks very much. Quite a number of interesting and important topics were raised by the students who invited me here, and I wish there were time to talk about all of them. I hope you'll feel free to bring them up in discussion. But I thought what I would do, rather than trying to review those briefly, is to focus on just one question, the most important question that's ever been asked in human history, a question that should be uppermost in everyone's mind. It's been hanging over our heads like a kind of sort of Damocles for many years, becoming more urgent every year, and it has now reached the point that the question will be answered in this generation. It's your challenge to answer it. Can't be delayed. The question is whether organized human life will indeed survive, and not in the distant future. The question was raised clearly to everyone with eyes open on August 6, 1945. I was then roughly your age, happened to be at a summer camp. I was counselor. In the morning, an announcement came over the loudspeaker saying that the United States had obliterated the city of Hiroshima with a single bomb, the atom bomb. People listened, a few expressions of relief, and then everyone went on to their next activity, baseball game, swimming, whatever it might be. I was horrified both by the news and also by the casual reaction. So utterly horrified that I just took off and went off into the woods for a couple of hours to think about it. It was perfectly obvious if you thought for a second, not only about the horror of the events, but that humans in their glory had achieved the capacity to destroy everything. Not quite at that time, but it was clear that once the technology was established, it would only be developed further, escalate, and would soon reach the point of becoming what Dan Ellsberg, in his recent book, essential reading incidentally, calls a doomsday machine, an automatic system set up so that everything becomes annihilated. And as he points out, we have indeed constructed such a machine, and we're living with it. Coming forward until today, leading specialists in these topics echo much the same double concern, but now in more stark and urgent terms than in 1945. One of the leading U.S. nuclear specialists, former Defense Secretary William Perry, has been touring the country recently with the message that he is, as he puts it, doubly terrified. Terrified by the severe and mounting threat of nuclear war, and even more so by the lack of concern about the possible termination of organized human life. And he's not alone. Among others, General Lee Butler, formerly head of the U.S. Strategic Command, which controls nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons policy. He recently reflected with deep remorse on his many years of service in implementing plans for what is sometimes called omnicide, crime far surpassing genocide, crime of wiping out every living organism. He writes that we have so far survived the nuclear age by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in greatest proportion. And he adds a haunting question. By what authority do succeeding generations of leaders in the nuclear weapon states usurp the power to dictate the odds of continued life on our planet. And most urgently, why does such breathtaking audacity persist at a moment when we should stand trembling in the face of our folly and united in our commitment to abolish its most deadly manifestations? Dan Ellsberg, in his recent book, again I urge that you read it if you haven't, describes the record that he reviews, mostly from inside the government at the highest planning level for many years. He describes it as a chronicle of human madness, and that's accurate enough. Repeatedly, we have come very close, ominously close, to terminal disaster. The record should really be studied carefully. It's shocking. Sometimes it's due to the reckless acts of leaders, sometimes our leaders, very often through just sheer accident. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There are actually hundreds, literally. Take one in 1960, when it was discovered that the Russians might have missiles or soon might have missiles. The first early warning system was set up to detect a missile attack. The first day it went into operation, it provided to high leaders the information that the Russians had launched a missile attack with 99.9% certainty. Fortunately, people didn't react the way they're instructed to react. It turned out that there had been some miscalculations, and radar hit the moon and actually bounced back, wasn't expected to bounce back. That's one case. A couple of years later, 1962, came what's been called, rightly, the most dangerous moment in history, Cuban Missile Crisis. The background is worth studying. I won't have time to go into it, but it is reckless acts of leaders, including our own leaders. At the peak moment of threat of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which came extremely close to terminal disaster, at that moment there were Russian submarines outside the quarantine area that Kennedy had established, and they were under attack by U.S. destroyers. They were dropping depth bombs on them. The conditions in the submarines were such that the crew could not really survive much longer. They were not designed for service in the Caribbean. They were designed for the far north. They had, U.S. didn't know it at the time, but they had missiles with nuclear warheads. And the crew at some point decided, look, since they're dropping bombs on us, they had no contact with anyone, there must be a nuclear war, we might as well send off the ultimate weapon. That would have been the end. There would have been a retaliation, and then we're finished. To send off the missiles required the agreement of 3 submarine commanders. 2 agreed, 1 refused, Vasily Arkhipov. One of the reasons why we're still here. 1970, many other cases. 1979, a national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was literally on the phone ready to call President Carter, saying that there was definite information of a massive Russian missile attack, when he got a call saying there was an error, so he didn't call him. A year later, Ronald Reagan came into office, and one of his first acts was to start a program to probe Russian defenses. The objective was to determine what kind of defenses the Russians had against our attack, if we had one. The official wording was to practice command and staff procedures with particular emphasis on the transition from conventional to non-conventional operations, use of nuclear, meaning use of nuclear weapons. The idea was to simulate air and naval attacks on Russia with the all of this made as public as possible to the Russians, because they wanted to see how they'd react, including simulated nuclear attacks. At the time, it was thought the Russians would probably figure out that it simulated, wouldn't react. Now that the Russian archives came out, turns out they took it pretty seriously, just as we would certainly have done. In fact, one of the leading U.S. intelligence analyses that recently appeared concludes from the record. Its title is, "The War Scare Was for Real." They took it extremely seriously. Right in the midst of this, the Russian detection systems, which are far more primitive than ours, did detect an ongoing U.S. missile attack. The protocol is for the human being who receives it. His name happened to be Vladimir Petrov. He's supposed to take that information, send it up to the Russian High Command, and they decide whether to release a totally destructive missile attack on us. He just decided not to do it. He decided it probably wasn't serious. Another reason why we're alive, can add him to the roll of honor. This goes on time after time. There have been literally hundreds of cases that came very close. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, as you probably know, established what they call a doomsday clock shortly after the atomic bombing. The first, what they do is every year a group of physicists, nuclear specialists, political and strategic analysts get together, try to assess the state of the world, the threats to the world, and set the minute hand of the doomsday clock a certain number of minutes before midnight. Midnight means say goodbye, we're finished. The first setting, 1947, was 7 minutes to midnight. It reached the most frightening setting, just 2 minutes to midnight, in 1953, when what was easy to anticipate in 1945 had happened. First, the United States, then the Soviet Union, carried out tests of hydrogen bombs, vastly more destructive than atom bombs. In fact, an atom bomb is just used as a trigger to set it off. It's a huge destructive capacity. That meant that human intelligence had reached the point where we could easily destroy all life, no problem. And the minute hand reached 2 minutes then. Since then, it's oscillated, but in recent years, it's been approaching midnight again. January 2017, right after Trump's inauguration, the minute hand was advanced to 2.5 minutes to midnight. Last January, after a year of Trump in office, it was advanced another half minute to 2 minutes to midnight. That's a sign that we have now matched the closest point to terminal disaster in the nuclear age, ominously close. And that was January. A couple months later, President Trump's nuclear posture review was released, raises the dangers further. I presume if the clock was set now, it might move another half minute to midnight. Well, I'll return to current crises, which are very real, and how they're being handled and what we might do about them to avoid disaster. But first, something else. Since 1945, we have been somehow surviving the nuclear age, actually miraculously, and we can't count on miracles going on forever. But we didn't know in 1945 was that humans were entering into another epoch, a new one, which is no less ominous. It's what geologists call the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch in which human activity is destroying the environment. There have been debates among scientists about when to date the onset of the Anthropocene. But last year, the World Geological Society determined that a proper time to set it is right after World War II. the same time as the nuclear age. And the reason is because of the sharp escalation at that point in human activities, which were significantly damaging and will soon destroy the environment for organized life. We might add that the Anthropocene carries with it automatically a third major epoch, which is called the Sixth Extinction. You look through millions of years of history, there have been periods when some event caused a mass extinction of animal life. The last one was 65,000 years ago, when an asteroid hit the Earth, destroyed about 75% of animal life, ended the age of the dinosaurs, actually opened a way for small mammals to survive. They ultimately became us. We are determined to become another asteroid intent on destroying most animal life on Earth, and we're well advanced in that process. And so there are three major epochs that we've been living with: the nuclear age, the Anthropocene, the Sixth Extinction, all accelerating. So let's just ask, how dangerous is the Anthropocene? Well, I'll give you a couple of recent illustrations from some of the leading scientific journals, recent articles. So I'll start with Nature, British journal, the leading general scientific article. The title of the article is Global Warming's Worst-Case Projections Look Increasingly Likely. I'm now reading it. A new study based on satellite observations finds that temperatures could rise nearly 5 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. The odds that temperatures will increase more than 4 degrees by that 2100 in the current scenario increased from 62% to 93%. In other words, pretty near certain. You go back to the Paris agreements, Paris negotiations, December 2015. The hope was in the international negotiations that the temperature rise could be kept to 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. And they considered that maybe 2% would be tolerable. Instead, we're heading to 4 to 5% with very high confidence. And here's one from the World Meteorological Organization, a recent one. Concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere surged at a record-breaking speed in 2016, last figures they have, to the highest level in 800,000 years. The abrupt changes in atmosphere witnessed in the past 70 years, the Anthropocene, are without precedent in the geological record. Globally, average concentrations of CO2 reached over 400 parts per million, up from just 400 parts per million in 2015, which has been considered the upper tolerable limit, so we're now beyond it. The concentrations of CO2 are now 150% above the pre-industrial level. The rapidly increasing atmospheric levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases have the potential to initiate unprecedented changes in climate systems, leading to severe ecological and economic destructions. The last time the Earth experienced a comparable concentration of CO2 was somewhere around 3 to 5 million years ago. At that point, the temperature was 2 to 3 degrees centigrade above now, and the sea level was 30 to 60 feet higher than it is now. That's what we're moving to in the near future. In fact, we're going beyond, because the prediction is to 4 to 5 degrees centigrade. Well, I'll leave the effects to your imagination. Here's a final example. Journal Science, one of the leading American science journals. even slightly warmer temperatures, less than anticipated in coming years, could start melting permafrost, which in turn threatens to trigger the release of huge amounts of greenhouse gases trapped in ice. There's twice as much carbon in permafrost as in the atmosphere. This will release huge amounts of methane, which actually is far more lethal than CO2, even though shorter persistence. And that accelerates other processes now very clearly underway, like the rapid melting of polar ice. Polar ice, as it melts, it reduces the reflective surface for sun's rays and creates more absorbent surfaces, the dark seas. So that accelerates warming, could lead to a nonlinear process in which everything blows up. It's leading, among other things, to the breaking up and the melting of huge Antarctic ice caps. One of them, West Antarctica, contains enough ice to raise sea level more than 10 feet. We're pretty easy to continue. In brief, the prospects are extremely serious. In fact, they're really awesome, which raises an obvious question. What are we doing about it? How are we reacting? Well, the world is actually taking some steps. Inadequate, but at least something. There's a commitment. And states and localities in the United States are also taking steps, which is quite important. But what is of prime importance, of course, is the federal government, the most powerful institution in human history. So what is it doing? It's withdrawn from the international efforts, but beyond that, it's committed to increasing the use of the most destructive fossil fuels. So our federal government, for which we are responsible, is dramatically leading a race to destruction while we sit and watch. That's pretty astounding. Now, that ought to be the screaming headline in every day's newspaper. It ought to be the main topic you study in every class. Never been anything like it. And it is astounding, as is the lack of attention. Another doubly terrifying phenomenon. We should be asking, among other things, what this tells us about our society and about our culture, what we're immersed in. And remember, all of this is imminent. We're approaching this rapidly. This century, it's your task to do something about it, and we're ignoring it. It's going on. We're racing towards it. We're ignoring it. Meanwhile, our chief competitor in destroying the planet, the Saudi Arabian dictatorship, has just announced plans to spend $7 billion this year for 7 new solar plants and a big wind farm. That's part of an effort on its part to move from oil, which destroys everything, to solar renewable energy. And this is Saudi Arabia, and that highlights how lonely we are in our race to destruction. Even the extreme reactionary dictatorship, Saudi Arabia, which lives on oil, refuses to join us in our unique insanity, which is dedicated to destroying organized human life. And it's not just the current administration. The entire Republican Party leadership agrees. If you go back to the 2016 primaries, every single candidate denied that what is happening, with the exception of those who were called the sensible moderates, like Jeb Bush, who said it's all kind of uncertain, but we don't have to do anything about it because we're producing more natural gas thanks to fracking. In other words, making it worse. The other sensible moderate adult in the womb, as he was called, was John Kasich, the governor of Ohio. He's the one person who agreed that anthropogenic global warming is taking place, but he added that we're going to burn coal in Ohio and we're not going to apologize for it. on ethical grounds, that's the worst of all. Think about it. Well, what about the media? They totally ignored this spectacle. Every crazy thing you can imagine was discussed extensively in the massive coverage of the primaries, but not the fact that the entire leadership of the party was saying, let's quickly destroy ourselves. Nothing. Go back and check. Almost no comment about it. The denialism of the leadership is having an effect on public opinion. So Republican voters have been climate change skeptics for a long time, way beyond anything in the world. But it's gotten far more extreme since Trump took office, and the numbers are pretty shocking. So by now, half of Republican voters deny that global warming is taking place at all, and only 30% think humans may be contributing to global warming. I don't think you can find anything like that among any significant part of the population anywhere in the world, and it should tell us something. One thing it should tell us is that there's a lot to do for those who hope that maybe organized human life will survive. And we're not talking about a remote future. Just think about the numbers I gave you before. We're talking about something imminent. Well, let's put that aside for a moment and go back to the growing threat of nuclear war. Are these ominous developments inexorable? So should we just throw up our hands in despair, say, okay, we're finished, have a nice time, goodbye? That's not at all true. There are very plausible answers in every single case that exists. Diplomatic options are always open, and there are quite straightforward general principles that can be quite effective. One principle is simple: obey the law. Not a particular radical idea, almost unheard of, but it could have some consequences. So what is the law? Well, there is something called the U.S. Constitution, which people are supposed to honor and revere. Constitution has parts, has Article 6, for example. Article 6 of the Constitution says that valid treaties are the supreme law of the land. Every elected official is required to observe them. What's the most important treaty of the modern period? Unquestionably, it's the United Nations Charter. Article 1 of the Charter requires us to keep to peaceful means, to resolve international tensions and disputes, and to refrain from the threat or use of force in international affairs. And I stress threat because that's violated all the time by every president and every high political leader. Every time you hear the phrase, all options are open, that's violating the supreme law of the land, if anyone cares. So let's take a couple of examples. So take Iran. It's an important example. There's a good deal of talk about the possibility that Iran may be violating the Joint Comprehensive Agreement, the JCPOA, the Iran deal. There's absolutely no evidence for that. U.S. intelligence says they're observing it. The International Atomic Energy Agency carries out repeated inspections, say they're observing it completely. But there's a lot of discussion about it. There's no talk about something else. Is the U.S. violating the agreement? Try to check and see if anybody's talked about that. Well, the answer to that's pretty simple. The U.S. is radically violating the agreement and has been all along. The agreement states that all participants, meaning us, are not permitted to impede in any way Iran's reintegration into the global economy, particularly the global financial system, which we pretty much control because everything works through New York. We are not permitted to interfere in any way with the normalization, I'm quoting it, the normalization of trade and economic relations with Iran. We're doing that all the time, and in fact are proud of it, all violations of the agreement. But it's ignored on a principle that's kind of interesting, the prevailing tacit assumption that the United States just stands above the law, including its own laws. So we don't have to observe our laws or any other laws because we're just unique. We do what we like. See if you can find an exception to that in the discourse on this topic. Well, in a couple of days, as you know, President Trump will probably withdraw from the treaty. Possibly, that's a gift to the hardliners in Iran. Tells them then they should maybe return to nuclear programs. That's an opening for the new National Security Advisor, John Bolton, for Benjamin Netanyahu, both of whom have called for bombing Iran right away, even while they fully respect the terms of the agreement that we violated publicly, quite publicly. There's no secret about it. And the consequences could be horrendous. But there happens to be a way of blocking those consequences, namely by the very simple device of respecting our own law. In fact, the supreme law of the land. Again, see if you can find a suggestion to that effect. Well, are there peaceful options? Pretty obviously. In this case, we could join the rest of the world, permit the agreement to continue to function. Or better, we might turn to improvement of the agreement. That's one thing that Trump has vociferously demanded. And there's good ways to do that. One obvious proposal for improving the agreement, which is ignored entirely, is to move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. There are such agreements in various parts of the world, Latin America, for example, and it's a step towards mitigating the threat of disaster. So what about a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East? If that were established, it would end any conceivable Iranian threat that you can imagine. So is there a problem of establishing it? Well, actually, there's one problem, but it's not the one that comes to mind. There's certainly no problem convincing Iran, because they've been calling for this for years, vociferously. Certainly not any problem with the Arab world. They're the ones who initiated the proposal 25 years ago. The rest of the world agrees as well. There's one exception, the United States. The United States refuses to allow it to proceed. This comes, you don't read this, but it comes up every couple of years in the annual review meetings of the Non-Proliferation Treaty countries, where it's continually brought up, continually vetoed by the United States, most recently by President Obama in 2015. And the reasons are perfectly clear to everyone. The U.S. will not permit Israeli nuclear weapons to be even examined by the international agency, let alone to be dismantled. So therefore, we can't proceed with this very simple way of eliminating any nuclear threat from Iran or anyone else in the region. And also not discussed is that the United States and Britain have a special obligation, a unique obligation, to pursue a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East. The region is a United Nations Security Council resolution 687, you can look it up on the internet, which was initiated by the U.S. This was the resolution that was initiated when the U.S. and Britain were, this is back in 1991. It's a resolution which called on Iraq to terminate any nuclear weapons programs. The U.S. and Britain relied on this resolution in 2003 when they were trying to concoct some pretext for their planned invasion of Iraq. So they appealed to this resolution and said, we think Iraq is violating it, which in fact they weren't, and they knew they weren't. But if you read that resolution, go to Article 14, it commits the signers to work for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. So the U.S. and Britain are uniquely committed to working for this by the Security Council resolution that they initiated. Well, again, check to see if it's ever discussed. So in short, U.S. willingness to observe U.S. law could bring this crisis to a very quick end and could even move on to a better solution. For example, if we were willing to observe Security Council resolutions that we ourselves instituted to end the illegal threats of force by every recent president and other high officials, and to end our constant violations of the Iran nuclear agreement. So there's easy answers to this crisis. Really simple. Obey the law, okay? That would end the crisis. Again, I advise you to search to see how often this is discussed and what that implies about our educational system, our culture, our media, our universities, and so on. Well, let's turn to the other major threat, North Korea. There has been a proposal on the table for some years about how to reduce the threat in Northeast Asia. It's called a double freeze. It was initiated by China, supported by North Korea, supported by Russia, general support throughout the world. The idea is that North Korea should freeze its weapons and nuclear programs, and in return, the United States should call off the threatening military maneuvers that the U.S. constantly carries out on North Korea's border, including flights on the border by our most advanced nuclear-capable bombers, warning of the threat of total obliteration of North Korea constantly happening. And it's no joke for the North Koreans. They have a little memory. We may want to forget it, but at the end of the Korean War, when it was more or less settled, U.S. bombing was so intensive that there was nothing left to bomb, literally. So the Air Force, General MacArthur, started destroying dams, major dams. And if you read the Air Force histories, they exult about this. It happens to be a crime for which people were hanged at Nuremberg, but again, we're above the law. But the North Koreans can remember, and when these advanced nuclear-capable bombers are flying there, it evokes a memory. So double freeze is one possibility. A double freeze could easily open the way to further negotiations. And at this point, the record becomes important. And you can find it in the scholarly record, not in the press, but in the scholarly record. There have been successes in negotiations. The major one was in 2005. The Bush administration was pressured by international pressure to return to negotiations, and the negotiations were extremely successful. North Korea agreed, I'm quoting the final document, North Korea agreed to abandon all nuclear weapons and existing weapons programs and to allow international inspections. In return for that, the U.S. agreed to establish a consortium that would provide North Korea with a light water reactor for medical use. It would also, U.S. would also issue a non-aggression pledge and an agreement that I'm quoting, that the two sides would respect each other's sovereignty, exist peacefully together, and take steps to normalize relations. Instantly, the Bush administration renewed the threat of force, froze North Korean funds in foreign banks, and disbanded the consortium that was to provide North Korea with a light water reactor. The leading U.S.-Korea scholar, Bruce Cummings, writes that the sanctions were specifically designed to destroy the September pledges and to head off an accommodation between Washington and Pyongyang. That was 2005. Well, I've been searching the press for some time to see if these facts can even be reported, breaking the constant refrain that North Korea has broken all agreements and so can't be trusted. Can't review it now, but I urge you to try. You'll learn a lot. Well, that path could be pursued again, but as we know, there are even better options, and it's worth taking a close look at them. On April 27th, North and South Korea signed a remarkable historic document. It's the Panmunjom Declaration for Peace, Prosperity, Unification of the Korean Peninsula. And it's worth reading carefully. I urge you to do it. Not the commentary, the actual words. In this declaration, the two Koreas, I'm quoting it, affirmed the principle of determining the destiny of the Korean nation on their own accord. On their own accord. Continuing to completely cease all hostile acts against each other in every domain, to actively cooperate to establish a permanent and solid peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, to carry out disarmament on a phased manner, to achieve the common goal of realizing through complete denuclearization a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula, to strengthen the positive momentum towards continuous advancement of inter-Korean relations, as well as peace, prosperity, and unification of the Korean Peninsula. And they further agreed to actively seek the support and cooperation of the international community, which means the United States, for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, it's important to read those words. Their import is very clear. What they're saying is the U.S. should back off and allow the two Koreas to achieve peace, disarmament, unification, and complete denuclearization on their own accord, in the words of the declaration. So we, the United States, should accept the call for support and cooperation in this endeavor by the two parts of the Korean nation to determine their destiny on their own accord. Okay? To put it more simply, the declaration is a polite letter saying, "Dear Mr. Trump, declare victory if you want to prance around in public, but please go away and let us move towards peace, disarmament, and unification without disrupting the process." That plea could hardly be more clear. And the general interpretation here is quite revealing. The general interpretation is that this complicates Washington's strategy. As the New York Times explains, quoting it, "Mr. Trump will find it hard to threaten military action against a country that's extending an olive branch." Okay? That's the liberal side. It's entirely true that threatening military action, which happens to be a criminal act, is hard when the target is extending an olive branch. So we have some problems. Well, case after case, I won't go through other cases, we find that there are peaceful diplomatic options. Can't ever be certain that they'll work, but we should always be prioritized in accordance with our international obligations, in fact, in accord with the supreme law of the land. Well, is it hopeless? No, it's not hopeless. Far from it. And we have plenty of evidence for that. So let's go back to a very important date in modern history, November 8th, 1916. Huge coverage of that date. And several events happened that are significant. The least significant of them was the one that gets most of the coverage. the election of Donald Trump. It's a little bit unusual, but it's not that out of the norm if a billionaire with huge amount of campaign spending and huge media support wins the presidency. That's kind of within the norm. But something really surprising did happen. The Sanders campaign. That broke with practically all of American political history. For well over a century, American elections have been mainly bought, literally. You can predict the outcome of an election with almost complete certainty by just looking at campaign funding. There's extensive, detailed academic study of this, both for President and Congress. What happened on November 16th was different. For the first time, a candidate came very close to winning the nomination and would have won the nomination probably if the Democratic Party managers hadn't manipulated affairs to keep him out, as Bernie Sanders. And he did it without any campaign funding from any of the major sources. No corporate funding, no wealth, no media support. He was either ignored or denigrated in the media. That's a real breakthrough. What's more, he ended up becoming by far the most popular political candidate in the country. Take a look at the polls that you can see on Fox News, in fact, well above any other political figure in popularity. Well, in a democratic society, the most popular political figure in the country who had just carried off a remarkable break in well over a century of political history, you'd hear him every once in a while. Okay, I urge you to take a look and take your own decisions. That's a more important event that took place on November 2016. Actually, there's another one which didn't get covered but should. At that time, the world was carrying out the successor negotiations to the Paris negotiations. The Paris negotiations on climate change in December 2015 aimed at a treaty, a verifiable treaty, to do something about this ominous threat. They couldn't reach a treaty for one reason. The Republican Party would not permit it. So they couldn't have a treaty. It was a voluntary agreement. The following year, 2016, they were meeting again to try to put some teeth in the treaty. On November 8th, the day of the American elections, the World Meteorological Organization, this was taking place in Morocco, Marrakesh, Morocco, the World Meteorological Organization released a study on the very dire state of the climate, kind of thing I gave a couple of samples of before. Then the election results came in. The meeting basically stopped. The question before the international world is, can the world survive when the most powerful country in history is taken over by a political party that not only denies that what is happening, but is committed to accelerate the race to destruction? And they kind of hoped that maybe China would save the world from disaster. Just think about that for a moment. Maybe China will save the world from the disaster that the Republican Party is bringing to the world. I let you think about that. But the fact is there are plenty of things that can be done. And the success of the Sanders campaign, and particularly the aftermath, lots of things are going on that fed from it. That could make a difference, but it doesn't happen on its own. And it takes serious engagement. Well, go back to the beginning. Your generation, that's you, is facing the most awesome question that has ever arisen in human history. The question is, will organized human life survive? And we're talking about the near future. Can't escape it. There are plenty of opportunities, like it or not. It's up to you to determine the fate of the human species. It's an awesome responsibility. It's one that cannot be evaded. Thanks. Okay, thank you. Now it's your turn.
Hello, hello.
How do you want to work this?
Hello. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to give a quick thanks to everyone for coming out tonight, and a great thanks to Dr. Chomsky tonight for this great delivery. Tonight we're going to open it up about 20-15 minutes for discussion and questions, so if you'd like to come up here to give your questions, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being able to come here. It's truly an honor to see you in person, and I really mean that. The question I have for you is, in your opinion, do you see a link between Islam as a set of ideas and Islamic radicalization, or is the latter solely as a result of American foreign policy?
Yeah. I don't hear it too well, so I'll have to hear the question repeated. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, can you just...
Sure, yeah. In your opinion, do you see a link between Islam as a set of ideas and Islamic radicalization, or is the latter solely as a result of American foreign policy?
See a link between
Islamic ideas.
Islamic ideas or
Practice. Yeah.
practice.
The question about Islamic ideas and practice. Well,
The latter solely as a result of American
I
foreign
mean, Islam is like Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism. You find all. There's no such thing as Islamic ideas. There are lots of different Islamic ideas, just like Christian. The real question we should be asking, particularly here, is what about Christianity? That's something we can do about. Okay? So that's the highest priority. So what are Christian ideals? Well, they vary all over the place. People in high places now claim to be devout Christians. And on the basis of Christian ideals, they're saying, let's proceed to destroy the world. I don't know anybody in the Islamic world who's doing that. That's, of course, not all Christian ideals. There are others, too. Martin Luther King expressed different Christian ideals. And it's the same with the Islamic world. You can find lots of things. But the idea that there are fixed Islamic ideals, which are a problem for the world, that doesn't mean anything. You have to look at, you take a look at individual cases. So take, say, Iran and the United States. Both states in which the leadership is claims to be deeply religious and committed to the faith, and asking what the two of them are doing with regard to the leading issue that they're now in conflict over. Turns out that the Iranian leadership is calling vociferously for establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region, which would end any threat. And the Christian United States, with its deeply Christian leadership, is saying, sorry, we can't, because we have to preserve Israeli nuclear weapons from inspection. Well, is it a problem about the Islamic faith?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Would it help if I approached you so that you could hear my question better, or you're fine? Okay. I really loved the theme that was present throughout your entire speech where you talked about the necessity of following the law. And I feel like a big problem that's playing into that currently is that white-collar illegal practices are not really being persecuted right now. So people in power, people of wealth are not submitting to the law. And I was wondering if you have any ideas on how we could reform the judiciary system that allows people to be persecuted if they're in a place of power or in a place of great wealth.
Well, there are easy ways for the people in power to be prosecuted. We have laws, right. Okay? So we could implement the laws. I agree that it's kind of unthinkable, but that's within our power, right? Yeah. It is within our power to compel the authorities who are technically under our control in a democratic society to do something simple like obey your own laws. Every administration says, no, that's impossible. So take, say, torture under the Bush administration. There was massive torture going on. There's no debate about this. When Obama came in, he determined that there would be no punishment for the torture. Actually, when you look back at the torture, it's kind of interesting. It's claimed that the Bush massive torture by the Bush regime on Guantanamo and all sorts of other black sites around the world, that was in violation of U.S. law. It's not so clear. The United States has never signed has really never signed the International Torture Convention. Under Reagan, 1984, the U.S. did sign it and ratify it, but with reservations. When the U.S. signs international agreements, almost always with reservations, and those are important to look at. The reservations excluded the kind of torture that the CIA has determined is the most effective torture. It's what's called mental torture, not electrodes on the genitals, but the kind of torture that doesn't leave a sign on the body, which is miserable, vicious torture. That they've determined, they picked it up from the KGB, the Russian KGB, that this is the kind of torture that really works. And that kind of torture was excluded when the U.S. signed and ratified the Torture Convention. It was then Clinton added further endorsement of that. Something else we might want to think about. And we might want to think about the fact that the new head of the CIA is a woman who was supervising this. But that's only one example. The case of the constant threats of war, and it's case after case. Like one thing that the U.S. is very proud of, talks about openly under Obama, was carrying out cyber attacks against Iranian nuclear systems, which severely harmed them. Another thing where that happens to be the Pentagon regards cyber attacks as an act of war. The new nuclear posture review states that cyber attacks are legitimate nuclear war in response. But when we carry them out, we're proud of it, okay? The drone campaign is a global assassination campaign. We assassinate anybody we think might be planning to harm us. Suppose that some other country did that. Say, suppose that Iran started assassinating every president. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, who writes in the main press that we should bomb Iran. No question about the threat. Plenty of other people who they think are harming them. Half the leadership in Israel. How would we react? Would we think, yeah, that's fine, I have every right to do it? We have to reach a level of civilization in which we are able to think about ourselves and what we do. It's really easy to blame others, right? But there's another question. What about ourselves? Can we reach a level of culture in which we can ask ourselves really simple questions like the kind you're asking? It's very hard. You take a look at the discussion across the spectrum and the intellectual culture, these questions just aren't raised. And that means a lot of work to do, serious work, starting right here in universities.
Thank you. Because of time restrictions, we only have time for 4 more questions. So I apologize for everyone who came up, but if you guys could please take your seats.
First of all, thank you for coming, and thank you for the great talk. So the political revolution that Bernie Sanders promotes is a bottom-up movement, and historically, bottom-up movements in the US that have succeeded have required the presence of a sympathetic government. So in today's conditions, when the government is unresponsive and can be quite threatening, how can a grassroots movement be successful?
Grassroots movement? Yeah, because that is the base of the Sanders. Well, just take a look at our own history. Let's go back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, black people were being lynched in the South with celebrations. A black person couldn't sit in a bus. A black student couldn't sit at a lunch counter. There were laws in the United States, up until much later, in fact, against miscegenation, which said that if anyone had 1 drop of black blood, which means any remote black ancestor, they couldn't marry a white person. That was the 1950s, actually, the 60s. Is it true today? No. Why? Well, one reason is a couple of black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to sit in at a lunch counter. They were, of course, immediately arrested and dragged away. Can't do a thing like that. I could have ended it, but it didn't. A couple of more black students came in the next day. It was a bigger arrest. Pretty soon you had some white students coming down to the South. You had the formation of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You had freedom riders going to areas in the South which are really like Nazi Germany, where you could just be slaughtered for trying to allow a black person to vote. In fact, I should say that when Nazi Germany, was searching around for some legal precedent for their racist laws, the Nuremberg laws, the precedent they hit on was the United States. The United States is the only country they could find which had laws like the miscegenation law. They didn't quite accept U.S. laws, because U.S. laws were too severe. The Nazis didn't accept the 1 drop of blood law, and they thought that was too harsh. But that's the United States. The problems aren't over by any means, certainly not over, but they're not what they were. And that's grassroots movements. Same with the women's movement, same with just about any advance in society that you can think of. These are not gifts from above. They come from activist movements. Often students are in the lead. There's a good reason for that. Students, not just in this country, other countries too, students, say you, are in a stage of their lives where they are uniquely free. Think about it. You're sort of out of parental control. You're not yet in a situation where you have to put bread on the table to survive. So you have a lot of freedom. You have a lot of freedom. You can think, you can talk to each other, you can go into, you're in a situation in any reasonable university, I'm sure here, where you can explore, you can acquire, you have the resources. It's a time when people can really think about things, not just about how to make money tomorrow. but about other more important things. And one of the results is students are often in the lead. That's why you had SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Freedom Riders and others. And the same is true today. So grassroots movements can do, in a relatively free country like this, almost anything. I mean, for fairly privileged people in the United States, like anybody here, it's a pretty free country by comparative standards, not like other places. So a lot of opportunities. The question is, do you want to take them? Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
In both The Doomsday Machine and his early memoir, Secrets, Daniel Ellsberg sort of describes a culture within military leadership, just of general disregard and dismissal of sort of civilian officials' authority in the general public. So that leads to the question of how are we able to affect change upon systems of power that ignore or reject our attempts as citizens to limit it?
How do you challenge the prevailing culture?
Yeah, sort of that.
How do we go about doing it?
Yeah.
Well, let's just take a look at the ways it's been done in the past. In the prevailing culture, in my lifetime, in fact, in recent years, the lifetime of all the faculty here, has changed. Attitudes towards lots of things have changed enormously. As I say, this country had miscegenation laws up into the late 60s. I mean, there was nowhere in the world where they had anything like that. Now, even the Nazis didn't go that far. Okay, it was changed. The United States had anti-sodomy laws up until the 2000s. Okay, that's changed. How you change take women's rights. I mean, until you go back to take a look at American history. When the country was founded, women were legally not people, literally. The United States took over British common law. You read Blackstone, British common law. Women are property, not people. A woman is the property of her father, and the property is handed over to the husband. Okay? In fact, you look back at the Constitutional Convention, some of the arguments against allowing women to vote were that it would be unfair to unmarried men, because a married man would have two votes, his own vote and the vote of the property. Okay? That's American law through almost all of American history. In fact, it wasn't until 1975, it's not that long ago, that the Supreme Court determined that women are peers. They have a legal right to serve on federal juries. Other things have happened too. Again, problems aren't over, but it's a huge change. And case after case, these are by no means the only ones, you find out that we know exactly how to proceed. Exactly how to proceed. It's been done over and over, lots of opportunities. It's just a matter of taking them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I was hoping you could talk about the neoliberalization of education, where students such as myself have incurred thousands of dollars of debt, where words such as diversity and inclusion are offered as hollow solutions to the effects of white supremacy and U.S. hegemony, and where student activists are punished more severely than racists and rapists on campuses.
Neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And how students are punished more than
How it's what?
and how activists and students are punished severely even more.
So how can we deal with the neoliberal programs?
Specifically within universities, how that's being pushed.
Specifically within universities.
Universities. Well, the neoliberal programs, which really took off under Reagan and Thatcher. There are a few things before, but these are, we could go through exactly what they were, but their consequences are very clear, and they were designed to have those consequences. So during the neoliberal period, that's basically since Reagan, wealth has highly concentrated in very few hands. And for working people, it's been stagnation or decline, literally. Real wages for American workers are actually literally lower than they were before the neoliberal programs began. Productivity per worker, amount of output per worker has about doubled, but wages have stagnated or declined. That money is going somewhere. It's going into very few pockets. A lot of it's going into financial institutions, which just exploded during this period and do nothing for the economy. They probably harm it. It goes on and on like this. This also incidentally undermines democracy by perfectly obvious means. Once wealth becomes concentrated and corporate power becomes unleashed, one of the things they do is just take over the political system by pretty obvious means, funding, lobbying, writing legislation, and so on. So the net effect is to make democracy much less functional. And we see the effects, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. Democratic institutions are under attack. The cover of the journal Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, this month, take a look at the cover. It says, "Is democracy dying?" It's the wrong question. The question is, are we killing democracy? And the answer is yes. We've designed systems which are killing democracy. You see it in election after election, not just in the United States, but through most of the developed world. Anger, fear, contempt for centrist institutions, they're collapsing, the main parties are collapsing, so the democratic system is being undermined along with the rest. Now, what's going on in the universities? Well, that's pretty interesting. Since essentially the 1970s, kind of neoliberal revolution, a number of very important things have happened. Remember that U.S. higher education, first of all, from K to 12, there's been radical defunding, just killing the system. And there are major efforts to destroy the public education system. Koch brothers, ALEC, the big lobbying organization for corporations, are carrying out programs state by state, systematically, to try to get state legislatures to pass laws which will essentially eliminate the public education system, defund it, make it private, part of the neoliberal system. Mass public education is one of the great contributions of the United States. That's one of the major U.S. contributions to modern democracy. Late 19th century, the U.S. initiated mass public education, which is extremely important. Established at the, and now they're trying to kill it. What about universities? Same thing. The U.S. established public universities, which were unknown in the world. In Britain, nearest analogy, they didn't really start public universities until after the Second World War. Red brick universities, so-called. It was elite universities. So the land-grant universities were extended generally. Higher education is also under attack. Students are under attack. Students are now coming out of college with huge debts. Is that an economic necessity? Of course not. Just take a look at other successful industrial countries, like, say, Germany, most successful industrial country. Education's free. Take, say, Finland, which ranks highest in all international tests. Education's free. Same in case after case. And the same is true in poor countries. So go south of the border. It's a country called Mexico. Okay? It's a poor country. Quite a good higher education system. I mean, Teachers are underpaid. It's a poor country. But Unam, major at university, I've lectured there, very high quality. It's free, okay? Take the United States. Up until before the neoliberal programs, higher education was pretty much free. It was a much poorer country then, remember. We're way richer than we were then. But the GI Bill gave free education and subsidies to huge numbers of people who would never have gone to college. It was very good for them. It was very good for the country. It wasn't flawless. It was racist, remember. Almost everything was officially racist. Housing, everything else. The GI Bill didn't reach blacks because of the segregated army till too late, you know. But it certainly was a major advance. In fact, even the Ivy League colleges were pretty much free. Actually, I went to one in 1945, University of Pennsylvania. Tuition was $100 a year, and you could easily get a scholarship, as I did. Okay, so has anything changed? I mean, then we were we're still a rich country, but much poorer than today. So is there any economic reason for the explosion of tuitions? No. Is there any reason why administration in universities has exploded while faculty decision-making has declined? Yeah, there's a reason. Imposition of business models. When you impose business models on universities, you get massive inefficiency. That's what the business world is. Administration, control, testing, and so on. Okay? So yes, these things are happening. I mean, they're not laws of nature. They're decisions, and decisions can be reversed. But to reverse them, you have to understand what's going on in the world. You have to find the sources and use all the means that are available to bring understanding to people and reverse what's going on. Now, it's not that hard. Laws can be changed. The Koch brothers don't have to succeed in getting state legislatures to destroy the public education system. They will if there's no resistance, but they don't have to. It's kind of interesting to look right now at the teacher strikes. One of them's in Arizona, where my wife and I live. This is the state that has the lowest, practically the lowest pay for teachers in the country. Teachers in the country are paid very low as compared to their skill levels in other occupations, roughly 75%. Arizona, it's about 60%. They're now all on strike, okay? West Virginia on strike, Oklahoma on strike, all the deep red states for good reasons. That's where the budgets are cut in order to kill the educational system and other benefits for people. And the teachers are not just striking for higher pay. It's important. They're striking to improve the funding of education so that teachers don't have to teach overcrowded classes, so that a class has chalk to draw on the blackboard, that teacher doesn't have to bring it in. So they're not just saying, give us higher pay. They're saying, revive the educational system so children will be able to have a decent education and go on for better lives and to improve the country. They're in the forefront of this, and they can be helped.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, we got to cut it off right now. So thank you, everyone, for coming. That's it with the questions. Please give a special thanks to Dr. Chomsky for coming out and talking to us today. We have to cut off now.